Joining us now is Dr. Sonya Okoli, who is the College Dean and Professor at the University of Georgia. Dr. Okoli, great to have you here with us today. Can you first talk about the significance of Juneteenth becoming a federal holiday?
Good morning. Thank you for having me. Juneteenth is a holiday that I think African Americans have been waiting decades to ensure that we receive some validation, some accountability measures in our government, that the events that happened in 1865 and the fact that enslaved individuals in Galveston, Texas, did not receive their notification that they were free until 3 years later. So this is monumental for so many reasons. And I know African Americans all over the world are celebrating this event, this holiday.
There are so many things to celebrate and also reflect upon at the same time. The celebration of liberation, but then also the self-reflection of the many years and decades and even centuries from that point in time where you still have some of the underlying systemic issues that persist in America as well. And so how can this day be used as a day of self-reflection and also course correction?
That's a really good point, Brad, and thank you for bringing that up. I mean, when I'm looking around at my social media feeds and my Twitter feeds and talking with friends and family, I think that there's mixed emotions. I think that it's a time of reflection that's twofold. On one end, like I said, we're happy, we're excited, it's been a long time coming. And then the other breath, it feels like a hollow celebration for many of us. It's an intention to celebrate freedom in a time where we are dealing with voter suppression. It ironically coincides with George Floyd and justice and policing and police accountability from Breonna Taylor, and of course the highly debated topic of critical race theory, which forces America to acknowledge and take accountability for the systemic racism that has had a long-standing effect because of slavery. So I think you're right. It is a time to reflect and it's a time to think inwardly, but it's also a time for the whole country to reflect, not just African Americans.
I naturally, sitting here at the New York Stock Exchange, think about all of the businesses that over the course of the year, when there is any type of holiday, businesses go and look for a reason to run a sale. And so at the end of the day,
Yes.
when we think
Yes.
about how businesses, companies, communities can make sure that they are commemorating this occasion, this event, without over commercializing it,
Right.
what
Right.
what is the best way to go forward with that from your perspective?
I mean, that's a really good point, and that's some of the alternative opinions that we have from people who feel like it's hollow. It's a time for Hallmark to make more money. It's a time for businesses to make more money. I mean, much like what we see in Cinco de Mayo, right? People flood the streets, people go buy things, they celebrate. I think that we can stay thinking about how this is something that is a long time coming. But I think if we focus our efforts into leveraging the fact that we finally gotten this holiday passed and we support measures like critical race theories in schools, that's something that will help us kind of water down any attempts to make this some, commercialized holiday. I think when you talk about communities, schools are the biggest, part of our communities. And critical race theory is something that is needed in schools. And I often talk about my children. I just had a conversation with my daughter, who's a rising fifth grader, and she had never even heard of Juneteenth. And so when we think about all the backlash that's coming about a concept that's over 40 years old, critical race theory is 40 years old. Bell, Crenshaw, and Delgado back in the late 70s and 80s talked about this idea that racism is a social construct. It's not just basic individual prejudice, but it is embedded in our legal system and in our policies, and it's systemic. So I think that if we just rally support around really paying attention to what's happening in various states about critical race theories being taught in our schools, I think we can, of course, eliminate those efforts.
As we talk about education and the schooling that takes place about the history of America Where can we start to have those conversations among school boards so that they know what is acceptable, what is unacceptable to omit as you are teaching the history of American history, which is very much correlated and intertwined with Black history as well at the end of the day. And for so many of the stories that have gone untold, how they can now be weaved into curriculum, and for even Juneteenth, because typically most schools are out by this time of year. So, it's hard to imagine that there will be a Juneteenth celebration at public schools. But if there is a way that this can be taught, that this can be commemorated, what would that look like?
That's a really good point. I mean, the educator in me is jumping for joy. As a college professor, there's always ways for you to reach across the curriculum. There's always ways for you to integrate what's happening in the real world into the classrooms. And you're right, you don't need a holiday to connect your curriculum to things that your students need to learn. I think that I think that we need to stop just talking about the plight of African Americans in America by first limiting how we insert it into our children's curriculum during the holidays. I mean, I know there's often a big push to talk about slavery during Black History Month, which a lot of us feel has been commercialized. But I think that if we just find ways to pull in what's happening politically, socially, in housing, economically, and break those things down into the day-to-day, it won't seem like a big to-do. Teachers won't feel this level of uncomfortableness when we're talking about Black history or slavery only during Black History Month. So I think educators can, do their due diligence even more than they already do, and trying to correlate and connect current events and current happenings in our society to those things that link to why critical race theory is important, to highlight those instances where we see a blatant attempt to silence voices or marginalize people of color and day-to-day happenings.
Doctor, just very briefly while we have you here with us, it's hard to omit from this conversation that you are in the state of Georgia. You are a professor at the University of Georgia as well, and college dean. And when you think about the new restrictive voting laws that have been proposed, that have been pushed forth within that state, and that have also permeated across some of the other states in a GOP-led fashion, this also comes after a time where we saw one of the highest turnouts among marginalized communities, historically marginalized communities, underrepresented communities, and communities of color over this last presidential election and general election. And so within the state of Georgia, how does a moment like this in Juneteenth also help advance and continue to raise the conversation around some of the restrictive voting laws and the undertones of systemic injustice that they still carry to this day?
That's a really good point. I mean, I think that, at this point, I'm a professor now at Beulah Heights University, which is right near the Capitol. I can see the Gold Dome from my office. And I think you raise a really good point. In Georgia, people often see Georgia as this place where people of color are flourishing. We're doctors, we're lawyers, we're engineers, right? But what people often do not see is that we still very much encounter the same issues of systemic racism in housing. Georgia is one of the most segregated places when it comes to housing. A lot of African Americans are concentrated either far east or far south. There's a huge disparity of wealth even within people of color. So I think that we can start making sure this conversation reaches a point of relevancy by ensuring that our local policies and procedures protect our educational system. It protects how our homes are valued. It protects our medical system. It protects our aging constituents, and we can just make sure that all these things are happening in our local community so that it reaches the community at large.
Certainly.
So Georgia is one of those places where people often assume that we're free from a lot of the things that other or smaller metropolitan cities may feel, or places that are rural, but that's really not the case at all.
Dr. Sonya Okoli, thank you so much for taking the time here with us this morning, college dean and professor at the University of Georgia. And everyone, stay tuned. Make sure to join us this afternoon, 1:30 p.m. Eastern, for a special episode of All Hands dedicated to Juneteenth. We're going to be speaking to New York Attorney General Letitia James and sharing a few ways to get on the celebrations and commemorations this weekend.